of this gathering, especially Robin Reese, who managed all of the logistical challenges of holding this gathering here at Union, as well as the staff of Color of Change and Define American. Without the dedication of many, many folks who are willing to devote many hours of service to this important effort, we wouldn't be here today. Well, before we get started, I just want to share a few thoughts about why I'm here today. When I published my book, The New Jim Crow, nearly a decade ago, I did not imagine that I would one day come to see mass incarceration as a two-headed monster. One beast, two heads. It is a beast that lives and moves through a vast network of institutions, policies, and practices designed to cage, control, and dispose of millions of people, overwhelmingly poor people of color, who are struggling to survive against all odds in a world that seems not to want them. One head of this beast is known by the name mass incarceration. The other head is known as mass detention. Different names, same beast. At first glance, from a distance, it can appear that we're dealing with two different beasts, with different parents, different genetics. But when you get close and you really begin to study this thing, you begin to realize that it's one beast with two heads, each head talking a different game, telling a different story, trying to distract us from the terrifying reality that this is one monster that rages on and is centuries old. The DNA is the same, and this beast behaves the same way wherever it is found. I did not see this reality clearly 10 years ago. This seems odd to me in retrospect, especially since I was obsessed back then with the damage done during the Reagan and Clinton eras, when the race to incarcerate reached breakneck speed, and the 1994 crime bill sailed through Congress, resulting in billions of dollars being invested in prisons and harsh new mandatory sentences and death penalties enacted. Countless forms of legal discrimination against people labeled criminals and felons were enacted into law. Somehow, I failed to appreciate that it was the same Congress and these same presidents that also built the architecture for our new system of mass detention. I missed the fact that the very first private prison was actually created for immigrants, private prisons that are now used to cage Black people in the hood as well. I did not know back then that the tide would turn and bipartisan support for downsizing our criminal justice system would emerge at the very same moment that we elect a white nationalist president, and that the new public enemy in our public political discourse would shift from Black people to immigrants, spawning billions of dollars of investment in new walls. Decades ago, we were investing billions of dollars on brand new prison walls. Today, politicians want the public to invest billions in border walls. Undoubtedly, some Black people are breathing a sigh of relief, grateful that the intention of this new monster, this old monster, seems to be diverted for the moment, focused on new prey. But history teaches that none of us are safe from this monster. We must slay this beast, even when that monster lives in our own minds, feeding on our own fears, anxieties, stereotypes, bigotries, and forms of greed. But slaying this beast is not enough. We must care for the survivors, repair the harm done, and build communities that are caring, inclusive, just, and committed to our collective well-being, to all of us or none. This gathering reflects a growing awareness that none of our communities can slay this monster alone. The Black-white binary has dominated the public discourse on mass incarceration, a binary that people like me have contributed to, and it must come to an end. We must begin to learn each other's histories, learn each other's stories, tend to each other's wounds, and then link arms as we face this monster, united, undivided. In my experience, most Americans don't know that in many parts of this country, Mexican Americans were lynched during the Jim Crow era. The whites-only bathrooms and schools meant that Latinos and Asian Americans suffered de jure segregation too in many parts of the country. Most Americans don't know how the war on drugs created a roadmap for the war on terror targeting Muslims, even as white men terrorized the nation with incessant mass shootings, shootings which are, if nothing else, terrorism. Why is it not called terrorism? As a nation, we barely know anything about slavery beyond the distorted pictures that are painted in high school textbooks, and we know even less about how this monster has worked to systematically control, exploit, and marginalize other groups of color in different times, in different ways, with similar results. We must learn each other's histories and stories, and we must learn more about how the systems that have been used to control, divide, and exploit us in different contexts, in different moments in time, are linked, are all part of the same beast. But above all, we must learn how to care for one another, love each other so fiercely that when a Mexican child is ripped from the arms of his mother at the border, and when a black child is ripped from the arms of her mother as she's arrested on the streets of New York, we feel the same pain, the same agony, as though it were our own children. For many of us, it is our own children whose lives are at stake. So let's begin this dialogue, this final conversation of an exceptional gathering. We've heard from people directly impacted by mass incarceration and mass detention about the physical, emotional, and spiritual toll these systems have taken on them personally, as well as their families and communities. We've heard an overview of the political realities and challenges, the current state of mass incarceration, and explored a wide range of philosophical, strategic, and practical issues relating to community organizing, media advocacy, social media, white supremacy, police violence, the experience of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and more. We're closing this gathering by reflecting on what unites us most deeply. What is the common moral vision that unites and drives our movements? Who are we collectively? What do we stand for as we confront this beast? What do we really believe? What visions, values, and belief systems do we share? And what are we willing to do or not do to be the change that we aim to co-create? These are profound questions. It's rare, to say the least, for advocates from different movements that are viewed as separate and that are often pit against each other, to come together not simply in a spirit of solidarity, but instead coming together to reach for something more, dig for something deeper, something more fundamental, more radical, and potentially transformational. But that's exactly what we're doing here. I would go so far as to say this conversation holds revolutionary potential. Some might argue that it's unnecessary to talk about morality or values. So long as we have common enemies and a shared political strategy, we're good. But history reveals that political alliances can easily be shattered by divide and conquer tactics, especially when there is no clear moral vision that unites people when it becomes, and it always becomes, politically inconvenient or costly to remain united. Without a shared vision of who we are, what we stand for, what we believe in, and what we aim to co-create, we can be easily divided, undermined, and co-opted. But there is another, perhaps even more important reason for us to end this gathering with a conversation about our moral vision. The fundamental question, what does justice require, is not at its core a political question. It's a moral one. So let's begin. We are gathered here because we understand that it's not possible to reimagine the meaning of justice in America without some kind of shared moral vision for our future. So we're here to dig deep and wrestle with some difficult questions about what we really believe, what unites us, and also what stands in the way of building a new moral consensus, one that truly honors the dignity and humanity of us all, no matter who we are, where we came from, or what we may have done. I have the honor of leading this dialogue with two amazing people, Jose Antonio Vargas and Desmond Meade. Jose is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, Emmy-nominated filmmaker, and Tony-nominated producer. He co-founded the nonprofit media and culture organization Define American. His best-selling memoir, which I urge you all to read, Dear America, Notes of an Undocumented Citizen, was published in 2018. Most recently, he co-produced the acclaimed Broadway play, What the Constitution Means to Me, which was nominated for 2 Tony Awards, including Best Play. Several years ago, as many of you may recall, the New York Times Magazine published a groundbreaking essay of Jose's in which he revealed himself to the world as an undocumented immigrant and told his story. A year later, he appeared on the cover of Time magazine worldwide with fellow undocumented immigrants as part of a follow-up cover story he wrote. He then produced and documented an autobiography documentary feature film that aired on CNN and received a 2015 NAACP Image Award. In that same year, MTV aired White People, an Emmy-nominated television special he produced and directed on what it means to be young and white in a demographically changing America. Desmond Meade, who I admire deeply as well, is a formerly homeless returning citizen who overcame many obstacles to eventually become the president of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, FRRC, chair of Floridians for a Fair Democracy, and a graduate of Florida International University College of Law. As one media outlet put it, when Desmond learned that he could not vote for his own wife, who was a candidate for the state legislature, he became president of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition and led the charge to adopt a constitutional amendment to re-enfranchise Floridians with felonies. As president of the FRRC, which is widely recognized for its work on felony disenfranchisement issues, Desmond has orchestrated the reorganization and incorporation of a coalition comprised of over 70 state and national organizations and individuals, which includes, but is not limited to, the NAACP, ACLU, PICA, Florida League of Women Voters, A. Philip Randolph Institute, PICO Florida, Florida Immigration Coalition, and many, many more. Desmond has received a boatload of accolades and awards celebrating his hard work and dedication, his leadership and commitment to social justice. He led the FRRC to historic victory in 2018 with successful passage of Amendment 4, a grassroots citizen initiative which restored voting rights to over 1.4 million Floridians with past felony convictions. Amendment 4 represented the single largest expansion of voting rights in the United States in a half-century. Desmond is presently leading efforts to empower and politically re-engage local communities across the state and to reshape local, state, and national criminal justice policies. Please welcome Jose and Desmond to the stage. Well, I just shared a little bit about what brought me here today, and I'd love to begin by asking each of you to share a little bit about what brought you to this conversation. Why are you here? Why do you personally believe it's important for us as we seek to unite our movements, to ground our work together in a shared moral vision? I'm interested in your story. What brought you to this conversation at this moment in time?
Well, thank you, Michelle, for such a wonderful introduction, first of all. I will send a check in the mail. But, that was, hearing that question really took me a lot of places. But I think, where I landed was you know, I mean, August 2005, South Florida, standing in front of railroad tracks, waiting on a train to come so I can jump in front of it. That day I was homeless, I was addicted to drugs, I was recently released from prison, and I didn't have any kind of hope, no self-esteem. I didn't see any light at the end of the tunnel, and I was ready to end it, my life. And that train didn't come that day, and I ended up crossing those tracks, and I walked a couple blocks further, checked into drug treatment. And after completing that, I moved into a homeless shelter, and while there, I decided to go to school for the purpose of not ending up at those railroad tracks again, right? And I did real well in school, eventually got accepted into law school. In May of 2014, I graduated with a law degree from FIU College of Law. Right? And I tell that story because I think what got me here was that moment in front of those tracks, right? The pain that I was experiencing. And it was a pain that wiped away all of the labels and all of the boundaries, and it took me to a place that was pure, right? And it took me to a place that really just dealt with, you know, my human existence. You know, and it had me challenge me with questions of why am I here? You know, what did I contribute to this planet? You know, what have I done with the time that I've been on this earth? And those questions really led me into a life of activism, and it led me in such a way to where I understood that, number one, that I didn't have a monopoly on the pain and suffering, and I definitely didn't have a monopoly on the solutions. And I understood that if I was to be a part of making my community a better place, then I had to find a way to connect with folks along the lines of humanity, around some shared values. And that led me to really starting the campaign for Amendment 4. And you know, a lot of people, you know, and we won, of course, in November, and a lot of people was like, man, that was a great thing because you re-enfranchised over 1.4 million Floridians. But I would always correct them and say that wasn't the biggest thing that happened. The biggest thing that happened was a manifestation of that journey that began at those railroad tracks, and that was that, you know, when we won Amendment 4, we had over 1 million more votes than any candidate on the ballot received, right? And that, as a matter of fact, we guesstimate that about 1 million people who voted for Amendment 4 also voted for the current governor that we had, right? Which showed that there was a broad cross-section of people who supported Amendment 4. And we was in Florida talking about felon voting rights, right? And those things were toxic, right? And that should have never happened. Amendment 4 should have never happened. And if it would have happened, it was supposed to face all these insurmountable opposition, right? But we had none of that, right? And so what we seen in November of last year, right, especially with those 5.1 million votes, none of those votes was based on hate. None of those votes was based on fear. Those votes was based on love, forgiveness, and redemption. And for a moment, this country actually got to see love winning the day. And that was able to happen because we were actually able to create a campaign that elevated itself above the partisan politics, above the racial anxieties, right? And to bring people together along some shared values that was based in our faith traditions, right? Love, forgiveness, redemption. That we don't have to vilify each other. We didn't have to tear each other down, or we didn't have to even prop ourselves up at the expense of others. That we could bring people together, knowing that if we were going to be successful in Florida, we needed everybody together. We needed everybody on board, and that's what we did. And it was love that allowed me to cross those tracks. It was love that allowed Amendment 4 to win, and it's love that had me here tonight.
All right. So let me ask a little follow-up to that, because I know you, Desmond, could be a lot of places right now. You're a man in high demand. So why here, this conversation about the unity between the movements to end mass incarceration and mass deportation?
Theological. All right, and so I tell people this, right, that we defied a lot of things in the campaign because what some folks didn't understand was that the campaign was divinely inspired to begin with, right? And it was divinely led from beginning to, and matter of fact, it's still being divinely led, right? And so everything about the campaign I knew came from a faith perspective, right? To where when you talk about, you know, especially when you look in the Bible, right? And some of the things that stuck out to me, that verse that says that so much as you have done to the least among you, right? That's what you've done to me, right? And it talks, and it further exemplifies it in 1 Corinthians 13, which is called the love chapter, right? And the love chapter basically say, I don't care how much money you have, I don't care how good you sing, or how good you can write, or how much money you donate, or how often you go to church. If you do not have compassion and love for that person that's in prison, that homeless person, or that immigrant, or that transgender person, if you don't love them, then none of that matters. None of it matters. And that's where we were, that no, we don't exclude people, we don't vilify people, we embrace, because every human being is God's child, right? And so how do we relay that message to folks in such a way that draws them in closer? And so me being here, I think, is like so fitting, because everything, my existence where I'm at right now, I mean, I was a homeless crack addict, right, that was getting ready to jump in front of a train. The day I sit here as Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world, that don't happen because I look good, you know?
I forgot that part.
Yeah, that happens because at some point I had to understand that I couldn't do things on my own, and I had to rely on a power greater than me, right? And that I had to submit myself to do his work and let him worry about the other things. And his work, right, his work was to take whatever experiences he brought me through, right, to use it to benefit my community. So no matter what station I was, it was somebody that could benefit from my experience. And in doing that work, just spreading that message about how, listen, no one is illegal. How could you be illegal? You know what I'm saying? Or what makes you less of a human because of your sexual identity, or where you're from, or the color of your skin, or your socioeconomic? None of that matters. What matters is that you're a child of God, and no matter how low you may have been at one point in your life, or no matter how low people might try to place you, right, that there's something special in each and every one of us, right? And so that all came from just a strong spiritual or faith grounding, right? That, man, listen, at the end of the day, I'm insignificant, right? What is significant is the work that we do and how we bring people together and tear down these barriers and these labels, right? And come together in such a way that we can improve our communities, move major policy issues, right, and make our communities a much better place to live. It started here for me, and I mean, deep in our faith, and so I'm here, and I'm like at home right now.
So Jose, I know that you don't identify as a religious person or as a person who is driven by faith, yet you are here as well, I know, for reasons that feel deeply personal and deeply moral as well. And so I would love to hear your story. What brought you here?
Okay. How many people here have been here since last night? Can you raise your hand? Oh wait, most people. So I've been kind of boiling since last night. So I don't know what's gonna come out of my mouth in the next, I don't know how long this panel is. So just forgive me if I say something crazy or, and Ryan, the executive director, I have board members at Define American here, like, oh my God, what is he gonna say? So I have to acknowledge, by the way, something that must be acknowledged. What Michelle Alexander, how she began this conversation, I don't think I've heard it articulated like that. And I was sitting there and I was thinking just what kind of moral, intellectual, human intelligence it takes for you to craft what you said the way you did. And I just really want to thank you for that. I'm sharing that because I wrote this book, and when I finished the book, which was like the only therapy I've ever had, I know, I'm trying to see a therapist, it's kind of hard. The first person I emailed it to was Michelle. I emailed her and I said, hey, we met at this thing. We don't really know each other. I finished this book. There's still grammatical mistakes, but can you read it? She's busy, of course, we're all busy. She said, yes. She read it, and then she gave me this fantastic blurb, which I was really proud that when you buy the book, it's the first thing you see in the back of the book is her name with that blurb. And when I wrote that book, as Michelle knows, I was kind of getting ready to leave this country. I've been here since I was 12, so that's, hold on, wait a second. How old am I? 38. So 26 years. I have a right as a consumer. I buy stuff. I have a right as in many ways, a participant. I write, I make films. I founded an organization with friends that's now co-hosting this event. But as a human being, I don't have any rights. And I thought that if I was going to be free, like really free, that I needed to leave. And you know this, Michelle, because the last quote in the book, you know, my mom said, and I thought it was right that she had the last say because she's the reason why I'm here and she's the reason why I'm alive. And when we were talking on the phone and I was writing my book and she said, you know, maybe it's time to come home, she said. Because you know, that is my right. We can leave. I don't know what y'all would do without undocumented immigrants in this country, but we can leave. But the miracle of staying and fighting for your freedom that doesn't necessarily belong in laws that are enacted or in conversations that don't make room for you. That's a really personal fight. And it's coming from a deep place. For me, it has to come from a deep place of love. And maybe it's the same love that, you know, like allowed my mom to do what she did. And then it's the same love that have given me a space so I can stand up like I'm actually worth something. And it's hard because when I started doing this work, because of what I've done, and you know, when you were reading my bio, I kept thinking, oh God, I'm totally manifesting the good immigrant model minority dreamer thing, which I get criticized for a lot, because you know, that's what we all do now, just criticize each other. And then I keep thinking how unsuccessful I feel. Because the kind of success I'm looking for is the kind of success that freedom can provide, which has to come from within. Right? And what we're here for, I hope, and in what you so brilliantly articulated, Michelle, is what does coming together with love look like? You know, Toni Morrison, of course, just passed. You should watch all the videos on YouTube. It's just incredible. But there was one speech that she gave, and she was asking all these questions, like dropping like bombs. In many ways, she's been asking this question of how do you define Americans? She just started writing, right? But she said, how do you narrate the self without erasing other people? If I were to define not just what American is, but what citizenship is, I would argue that that's one definition. Like, how do we tell our stories? How do we sit in our chairs? How do we convene in our homes, realizing that our equalities are actually tied to one another? Now, I don't know if that's faith. I don't know if that's, when you kept saying a man of faith, my first experience with faith was my grandfather finding out I was gay and kicking me out of the house because we're Catholic. And so I had to find a different kind of faith, right? And actually, for me, it was Baldwin. It was James Baldwin that led to Toni Morrison, that led to this idea that faith is knowing that what is happening to us was not intended this way, that there is something better. And I think hopefully that's the faith that we take as we get into this, deeper into this conversation, is like what that actually looks like in words and in action.
Yeah.
And I'm supposed to be the one that cries a lot, right?
I usually don't do that, by the way. Oh, man, I'm so sorry.
No, you're my brother. We good now. I'm going to be crying later on.
So I'm curious what a moral future looks like to you. Like when you think about what it is that you really believe and what we're fighting for, and you picture it in your mind, what do you see? This moral vision, what does it look like to you?
So, Michelle, I don't know if you remember a few years we were in Louisiana, and you told a story about the homeless people in this community, and you was like, hey, that church over there feeds you? And I'm like, yeah, we go there, eat all the time, and they're like, that they give you clothes? And like, yeah, we go there and get clothes all the time. And then you were like, it would seem to be that would be a nice church for you to join. And they were like, no way. And that kind of like threw you off, like, why? And their answer was, in spite of the fact that they went there to eat and to get clothes, that was the one place where they felt the most shame, right? And so when you talk about this morality, and I don't look at the building, I don't look at the religion. What I look at is how do we see each other, right? And in such a way to understand that, how, for instance, one of the things that I get out, and I'm always, I constantly refer to the Bible. I'm not a preacher. But, how do we get to that space where we want for our neighbor what we want for ourselves, right? And I think that when we operate in that space, we find those morals, right? Because, how do we feel if our child was ripped out of our arms? How do we feel if our child was gunned down in the street and left there like an animal? How do we feel, if we make a mistake and we're put in cages, right? And was forced to wear a scarlet letter of shame for the rest of our lives in spite of what we do, right? And coming from that perspective, what is that outrage you would have for having to experience that, right? And then think about it, how other people are experiencing that, right? And letting that be your guiding force. And so, what does it feel like, to be an institution of faith, but yet you don't have compassion, right, for the least among you, right? What is that, And are you really a person of faith? Is this really, you have to question that. And I think that when you find that moral space, it's not this neat box with the brilliant ceilings and the beautiful organs. It's none of that. I think it's a space. It's a esoterical or somewhere out in the galaxy somewhere, but it's in a different dimension, right, that you operate in, knowing that at the end of the day, it's how do I see myself and others? How do I see them and myself, and how do I operate from that?
Let me push you on this a little bit.
Push.
One of the things that I've noticed over the years since publishing my book is that I'll have situations where people will come up to me and say things like, your book really moved me, it broke my heart, I feel terrible what's happening. And then I'll say, well, do you support the decriminalization of drugs? Well, no, not necessarily. And I'll say, well, how do you feel about the way the police are behaving in the community? Well, I don't know, the police have a hard job and they have to do what they have, And so that there's a way in which I think we've allowed some people, particularly people of faith, but not only people of faith, to imagine that they care in their hearts. And maybe even visiting prisoners and doing ministry, people in prison, visiting people in prison and doing ministry, but then not actually committed to changing the material conditions, not actually committed to taking a position on whether or not we should still be building prisons today, whether or not we should be locking people in literal cages. And so even as, I was thinking about this panel and trying to have a conversation about moral vision, it occurred to me that we have to find a way to talk about morality in a way that isn't disconnected from the material conditions people are living in. And so I guess my question for you is, knowing, and I know you are deeply committed to changing the material conditions, so I'm not suggesting otherwise, I guess, does having a moral vision that you would want for someone else, what you would want for yourself or for your own children, require you to take clear stance in moments of controversy, in times of crisis? Is it immoral to remain neutral or to remain in a state of voluntary confusion, which is, I think, what many people claim to be in?
Yes, it does require you to take a stance, but what I would, and it's not necessarily, I would push it a little further, right? Because the people that you may think take a moral stand because, oh, yes, I see what's going on with those people and it's bad, right? I would say that they have not connected yet because they said those people, right? I think the time that we're connected is when it's not those people anymore that's suffering, it's us that's suffering, right? And I think that when it's us that suffer, then there's a natural reaction that would compel you to actually do something instead of just taking this stand back approach. So, for instance, if you and I are in a car driving and I have a splitting headache, you might empathize with my pain, and you might want to take me to the CVS to get something for my headache. But you might want to go to the CVS in which you know that what you're familiar with. I'm experiencing that pain. I want that pain gone now, right? I want to take immediate action right now. And it's a difference, right? And so until you could actually take my pain on as yours, then you're only going to go so far. Yes, it's bad what's happening to those kids on the border, but that doesn't compel you to action. What compels you to action is when it happens to your own kids. And we see it even like with gun violence, right? In our communities, you would see that people would not take a stand, all right, about gun violence in their community and would not have anything to do with it, will be totally out the picture until their own son is gunned down, right? And why does it take our own child to be murdered before we take a stance on the violence that's going on in our community. And that's because we always looking at those and others and not understanding that there is no me without you. And there's no you without me. And the pain that that person is suffering, I have to feel that pain, and I have to move according to that pain and not wait for something to happen here. And so I don't know if someone is taking a moral stance when they're separating themselves from the problem. I think that moral guidance begins once we're all in this thing together.
I've been thinking about your question, and one of the things that's been evident by this conference is how do we work towards shared language? Right? I actually thought, Michelle, you've already done that with the introduction. But I kept thinking, for example, like give you a very specific example, open borders, right? Which is like a narrative that's been cemented in our psyche really since the rise of Fox News in the 1990s. The same era that we were getting tough on crime was the same era that we were getting tough on illegals, right? That's the same era. The era when legislation was passed, law was passed, so an undocumented immigrant like me, who's been here since I was 12, a law was signed so that the only reason for me to actually get legalized is to leave the country, accept what's called a 10-year bar, and try to come back. Now mind you, if I were Mexican, if I crossed the border from Mexico, and I've done that twice, I'm barred for life. Like that's the law, right? So open borders, that was like the rise of that. And when you look back at the way that's always been framed, when it comes to capital, when it comes to corporations, when it comes to, whiteness as ideology, the borders have always been opened, right? So long as they were the ones doing the moving, and so long as they were the ones moving people somewhere, like 400 years ago, right? When the first group of Africans arrived in this country to be brought as slaves. So I think even that understanding, which I don't think we in the non-black immigrant communities understand as well as we should. So it's really specific. So a few years ago, I have this weird thing where I can't get a green card, but they give me honorary degrees, which is like really nice, but a green card would be better. I'm not, I got one at John Jay College for Criminal Justice. I was like, oh, okay. And it was a free flight, and so I brought my grandmother and my grandfather's two sisters. So 3 70-something women from California to here, and then I took them to Ellis Island, which I had never gone to before. I don't know if you've been, I highly recommend it. And so we go to Ellis Island, and the hall where they show the history of immigrants, and then there's an entire section that talks about the Middle Passage, and an entire section that talks about Native Americans, the Trail of Tears. So I took my grandparents and explained to them what it was, especially my grandmother, Florida. This is being taped. She might be watching this. I love her. She's the reason why we're in this country, right? She got her in 1969 and then petitioned everybody else to get here legally after the 1965 Civil Rights Immigration Act, which would not have happened if it was not for the Civil Rights Act that happened the year before. Who is one of the most anti-black people I know is my grandmother, Florida, who would say things about, why are they in the projects? Are they just too lazy? Like, why are they, like, we've been here 20 years, we bought a house, they've been here like forever. And like, she would say those things. When I was a kid, I would hear her, and what do I say to her? And of course, it's so easy to call out people, strangers on Twitter, but to sit with your grandmother and explain something is really hard. So when I took her to Ellis Island, and I was explaining to her what the Middle Passage was. The systems that were created where people had to get in those ships, sit in their excrement, got here, no language, no family. I mean, slavery is the most anti-family institution that was created. So my grandmother starts crying. She didn't know any of that. She passed the U.S. citizenship test. She owns 2 homes in Santa Clara. She sent kids to school, but she did not know the very fundamental story about how the country was founded. And then, when I started telling her the Irish story, the Eastern European Jewish story, she goes, oh, ang mga puti ba immigrants din? Which means, oh, white people are immigrants too? Because she had so swallowed that when immigrants are being brought up, it means Latinos and it means us. When America happens, it's about white people and black people. So those to me are the kind of the shared language that we all must work on. To me is at the very foundation of how we get to this moral, to this vision, to a shared vision. Without that language, I think it's going to be really, because we're having this conversation amongst people like us who agree on this stuff. Imagine if we're doing this in Ohio, or in Florida, or Wisconsin, or one of these 4 battleground states next year, right? If we can't even do that within our own allies, then where are we going to do it?
Yeah, I find myself in recent years thinking a lot about kind of what my moral commitments require of me, and challenging myself to become more concrete with that answer. And part of what it's required is being more honest with myself, but also in public speaking and dialogues, that this beast, as I call it, this is a beast of white supremacy, this is a beast of global capitalism, that if we're going to slay this beast, we are going to have to challenge capitalism, we're going to have to challenge white supremacy, we're going to have to change the greed within us, face the greed and the consumerism within ourselves. As we challenge these systems at the same time, we're going to have to face our own bigotries, our own forms of self-hatred, the ways in which we've been conditioned to fear our own as well as the others. And we're going to have to do it within ourselves as, at the same time, that we're challenging these other systems. We'll have to be more courageous when faced with questions like, do you really believe in a world without prisons? I feel like I have to muster the courage to say, yes. I believe that one day we will look back on the practice of caging human beings with as much horror as we have, other horrifying practices, beginning with slavery and the genocide of Native Americans, but continuing with things like chopping off people's hands. There was a time when that seemed so horrific, and yet if you were to ask someone who's serving a sentence of 25 to life and is missing out on their kids growing up and are away from their loved ones, if you could get out if someone chopped off your hand, I bet many people would say, that would be better. I would give my hand if I could go home to my family. And yet we think of chopping off people's hands today as some barbaric practice that we've left behind. But what we're doing today in so many ways is more cruel, more horrifying, more traumatic. And so I'm curious if you feel as though your moral commitments are challenging you in ways that kind of forcing you to go beyond where you've been before in terms of your advocacy, in terms of what you stand for or speak for, or if you think our movements need to be challenged in ways to move beyond kind of where we may be right now.
You go first.
So I want to answer that in a roundabout way. Especially, I want to touch on something Jose talked about this shared language, which led me to think about this narrative, this dominant narrative that has been just fueling a lot of the systems and atrocities that we've had to experience. When Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman and they had the trial, I remember that this whole country was, that rallying cry was, I am Trayvon, right? I am Trayvon, I am Trayvon. I think even the president might have said it. And it was so popular that even white people were like saying, I am Trayvon, and wearing I am Trayvon t-shirts. And at the time, I remember thinking that, I think that was a cop-out. I thought that if we were really serious about changing these conditions, that we would not have been saying, I am Trayvon. What we would have been saying was, I am George Zimmerman, right? Which challenges us to start looking at how we react to young black men. Not how George, because it's easy to vilify George Zimmerman, right? But I know, and I knew at the time, that I would be more scared of Trayvon than a white person walking down the street, right? And that I would be more likely to bring harm to Trayvon. Me as a black man is more likely for me to bring harm to Trayvon than some other white guy, right? And what is it that, and so saying that I'm a George Zimmerman, what it does is actually just challenge us to really look deeper, look beyond, and say, what is this narrative that has been in our society for so long that causes us to fear our own, that causes us to look at each other as criminals, right? That causes us to hate, especially like in South Florida, there's a huge divide between the African American and Latino communities, and there's even a divide between the black immigrant and the Latino immigrant community, and it causes us to hate each other while we're supposedly together fighting these systems where we're not, because we're not even understanding that narrative that causes us to hate each other, right? And I think that being able to identify that, being able to I'm going to say this piece and then I really want to hear what you have to say, Jose, but I remember when Michael Vick was convicted for the dog fighting thing, and I know that dog fightings are like very brutal sports, right? It's like cockfighting. It's gory. These dogs get in the cage and they fight each other to the death. It's very violent, right? And I remember, during that time when I used to ask people, how many people got mad at the dogs? How many people looked at those dogs and said, those violent criminals or those bad folks or those undesirable? How many people looked at them like, no one got mad at the dogs. As a matter of fact, what they did was they wanted to find the dogs loving homes, right? They wanted to put those dogs in a much better situation. What they got mad at was the people that created the conditions, right, that caused these dogs to fight. They got mad at the people that trained those dogs, the conditions, that system, right? And so being able to, bringing this thing all together, is that in order for us to really be aligned in this moral trajectory, right, that we can't just haphazardly glance over what we are actually dealing with internally, right, as individuals and even as organizations, that we must have the moral courage to dig within us, to expose how deep these false narratives have even penetrated ourselves, right? And then we are, I think, positioned to really begin that journey to that place that we're aspiring to be, place where there's no prisons, because it's hard to even get people to even start thinking in my community about a place where there's no prisons, because in their heads there's a whole bunch of bad black folks that need to be locked up. Let's lock them up and throw away the key. So they're not even there yet, right? And I can't even have a conversation with somebody about abolishing prisons, right, without first dealing with those issues or that narrative that creates that need for prisons, that need for divisions and labels.
Oh gosh. Okay. Moral commitment. So there's a woman here. I'm totally gonna embarrass her. Marcia Davis. Can you stand up, Marcia? I'm so sorry. I'm about to embarrass her. She's not gonna want this. Sorry, Marcia. There she is. She was my editor at the Washington Post. She whipped me up into shape. But moral commitments, it starts this way for me. So I was working on a series. Oh, we're good, Marcia. She's like, I was working on a year-long investigative series about HIV/AIDS crisis in Washington, D.C. This was in 2006. At that time, D.C. had the worst AIDS rate of any other city in America. The AIDS rate was about 4%, which is the AIDS rate in sub-Saharan Africa. This was in Washington, D.C., which actually happened a lot because it was the only city in the country that couldn't use its own tax dollars to fight for what was happening in the city. Because D.C., taxation without representation, right? People have no vote in D.C. And one of the stories I worked on was a story for 6 months on this formerly incarcerated HIV-positive group of men. Who, I was 25, I looked like this, I found out about them, I showed up to one of their meetings on Wednesday afternoon from like 12 to 2. They're like, who is this guy? I had to explain what the Philippines was. No one was like, you're not Chinese? Nope, I'm Filipino. And then one of them said to me, why are you here? Do you want to hear our sob stories? So then I learned the value of like deep listening. Like I would go for, I think 2 months without writing anything down. I just wanted to be present. Because they would talk about how they got infected with the juice, which is what they call HIV and all that. And I was sitting there as a 25-year-old undocumented immigrant working for the Washington Post. Nobody knew, not Marcia, that I was undocumented. Had no right to be in DC, had no right to have a job, had no right to really be here. And I remembered sitting, because thankfully then I earned their trust and they let me in and I wrote the story. And I kept thinking, if they're born here and if they're citizens, if we can't treat them the way they should be treated, then what right do I have to ask something that's not even being given them? I've never articulated this before, but this is what's happening to me tonight. But those were kind of the deep, that's what I had internalized, that I come to this country that was founded on stolen land that enslaved people so that it can be what it is. Then I get here, and I'm not black, and I'm not white. I'm looking around going, okay, what happened? What am I responsible for? Where do I fit in? What's my role? Do I have a voice? And I had so internalized that because those men, it was like 8, 10 of them, because they didn't have a voice, so therefore I said, well, maybe I don't have a voice too. And that's why journalism was perfect. You just write the stories, you don't become the story. So it wasn't until the past few years and really like the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, where it is now, right? That seeing kind of how this country is waking up in a very different way, I think. And you're right, Michelle. Who would have thought that when you published the new Jim Crow 10 years ago that we would be now in what? Reparations is an actual mainstream political conversation in the 2020 campaign. So when I talk about moral commitments, I think this commitment of when we say equality, we actually get to the really root of who we're talking about and how it applies to everyone. And I'm articulating this and I wonder how my own families, I was talking to Rashad when he gave this presentation today. So I'm Filipino, as I said, we have big ass families, like Italians, right? Big families. I have 33 relatives in the Bay Area who are Filipinos. Out of 33, 18 were eligible to vote. Out of the 18 people eligible to vote, only 5 voted. And we're all Facebook friends. So they see my posts, I can't vote, please vote, right? So then I interviewed them after the election. And then one of my aunts, who I love, says to me, Ton, that's my nickname in Tagalog, Ton, I bought a house, I drive a Camry, I sent your cousins to school, I'm done. Again, America is a black and white thing. We don't participate in it. We're just here to work. We're just here to work. So I think that's a part of this conversation. And I think it has to be a part of when you said, Michelle, at the beginning of this talk, how do we look beyond the black and white binary while, of course, acknowledging what that built and how we got to where we are? that to me has to be a part of how we make this, what those moral commitments are. We were just, Desmond and I, actually, you're gonna have to tell the story, but, so one little anecdote. Netroots Nation, do you know what that is? It's like the largest gathering of progressive people. 2015? 15. They asked me to moderate the presidential forum because they thought, hey, he's undocumented, he's a journalist, he should moderate this. And they thought I was gonna, do softball questions, but I'm trained by Marcia Davis, I'm a good journalist. So I came in there prepared, Bart O'Malley, what were your plans in the police force in Baltimore? And then a group of Black Lives Matter protesters led by Patrisse Cullors started to go to the stage. And everybody freaked out. Martin O'Malley said something, he said all lives matter. He said something that was pretty like, what? And then Bernie Sanders, cranky as hell. Sorry, I've never voted, so I'm not for anybody. He comes out, cranky, just cranky. And the women, it was after the day after Sandra Bland. So they were saying, say her name, say her name, say her name. And he goes, aren't you in charge here? And then a few of the organizers got on the stage and said, kick them out. You kick out 30 black women out of this conference. Like, you out of your mind? How am I gonna call Marcia and all the other black women who have mentored me since I was like, are you out of your mind? And so I didn't. I just stood there and I gave them the mic. I invited them up. And, so now I'll tell you, because I have to tell you, I've been detained before. I've been in a lot of bad situations. That's one of the top 3 bad situations of my life. It was being aired live on CNN. It was awful. So, Desmond, go ahead.
Nothing left for me to tell. I think, because I wanted to share with Jose that sometimes because we do things and don't really realize the impact of what we're doing. And I know that because Jose was who he was, he actually, just being who he was, created space for the women to come together and the activists to come together and have some type of hope that they could pull this thing off. And, I was just privileged enough to, it was at that same Netroots was when I got that much needed spark to propel the ballot initiative to where it was at anyhow. So that was really cool. But to see, and I told him that, I do believe that because of that experience, it caused, because Bernie Sanders was experiencing all of that, and I think it caused him to actually a shift and make necessary alignments that propelled him to where he is today. And it all started right there by actually just giving women the stage. And so, but I got to say this piece though, because you hit me when you talked about your aunt that said that she sent the kids to school and that she did her job. She works, right?
She's a U.S. citizen by a naturalized U.S. citizen. But she sent the kids to school. She has a job. She bought a house. She drives the Camry.
And what did she say?
She's done.
She did her job.
She did her job.
All right. And when I heard that, what went in my head was because, like, in Florida, a quick example. In 2011, I remember Rick Scott won the election. He beat Alex Sink, right? And he won that election by around 65,000 votes. That year, over 808,000 registered African Americans and 912,000 registered Latino Americans did not vote in that election. They were registered. So you had over 1.7 million people of color who was registered to vote but didn't bother to mail in the ballot in an election decided by 63,000 votes. Now, Rick Scott went on and assaulted people of color for his 4 years in office. I mean, he believed that, and he's in a room full of Latino evangelical clergy, declared that people crossing the border from Mexico was bringing diseases to this country, and they were all criminals, and they was coming to rape our women and burn our villages down. And so I thought that Rick Scott was one of the better governors in the history of Florida, and the only reason was because he was managing to piss off so many different constituency groups that they were going to finally propel people, particularly people of color, into being more civically engaged. And I mean, because he was accused, he even insinuated that our black legislators all came from broken homes. He tried to drug test welfare recipients because we're all black, you know, and we use welfare money to buy drugs. He runs for re-election. And this time he beats Charlie Crist, and he wins by 65,000 votes. That year, the number of African Americans who was registered increased, that didn't vote, increased to over 1.3 million. Wow. And the number of Latinos increased to over 1.1 million. So now you have 2.4 million people of color who didn't vote in an election decided by 65,000 votes. And so when you said the thing that your aunt said, you know, I relived some of the frustration of being in black communities and trying to compel people to turn out and vote, and don't you see that this will change your situation? And just like your aunt said that she did her work, the black folks said, I'm just trying to survive. And they're so busy trying to survive and think that, listen, I don't have time to go vote. Man, I'm trying to survive, right? And so when you said that, it really, really just hit something. I mean, I just really had to share that.
That brings me exactly to the question I have for you, which is, what do you see, and we're going to get to the challenges in a minute, but what do you see as some of the most important opportunities that exist right now? And again, kind of bringing it back to the concrete, what are some of the opportunities that we have right now to organize our communities around clearly defined political goals that are grounded in our moral vision that will help inspire people to believe that it is worth their time to vote? And I'm one of those people who, you know, I get a little uncomfortable if I think people are shaming those who don't vote. Because I think there's good reason for people to feel like their vote doesn't matter. You know, many people had turned out to vote during the Clinton years and got locked up and their welfare taken away, and so why should I vote? That doesn't matter. Things stay the same no matter what I do. There is some truth to that, and yet there is also powerful truth in that when we organize, and not just turning out for a presidential election, but when we organize around kind of the issues and the causes and concerns that matter most deeply to us and that are aligned with our moral vision, that we have extraordinary power. And so where do you see the great opportunities or potential opportunities today that we ought to be going after, and going after together, as movements for mass incarceration and mass detention?
Wow.
You want to start?
Yeah, so, and you know, can I back up a little bit, Michelle? Okay, because this movement for mass incarceration and mass detention, I learned early on when I just started going to school and getting into felon disenfranchisement, and I was doing the research, and I think SB 76, I think it was, right? It came out around that time where it was model legislation that came out of ALEC, right? That was, and the people that helped draft it was like the GEO group and CCA, right? And then I remember the portion in your book that talks about every time we have a huge victory, somehow or another the forces come in and manage to separate us, right? And I discovered that the same forces that was like funding these candidates that was so-called tough on crime was the same forces that was sponsoring anti-immigration bill legislation, right? And I was like, wow, okay, wait a minute. You mean to tell me that I can sit down, and I thought about when when Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. You know, I really feel he wasn't assassinated for fighting for black folks. He was assassinated when he made this an economic argument, and it brought together black and brown bodies, right? It brought together poor people, and he became a threat then, right? And that from since that time that we have, when you talk about mass incarceration, mass detention, that we actually have an opportune moment to sit together at the same table and understand that, you know, when you close your eyes and you think of immigration, that we think of the Mexican, and when we close our eyes and think of crime, we think of the black person, and understanding that it's not separate fights against Mexicans or against black people. It's a one single fight against dignity, human dignity. It's one single fight. There is no separation. Now understand that the same forces that want to separate families at the border are the same forces that's been destroying families in our communities for decades, right? And so I want to just put that out there, because I think that in the immigration movement and in the mass incarceration movement, that there's so much gems there, that if they could only cross-pollinate, right, and come together, that's what I'm hoping for. So when you talk about the good things, because what we did with FRRC was we kept directly impacted people at the center, and not just as figureheads, but directly impacted people as part of creating the strategy and it was the spearhead in implementing it, right? And so we got people who could not vote to go out into their communities to talk to their family members and their friends and their neighbors about how important it is for them to be their voice, since they didn't have one. And we stole that, right? Because I remember years ago when I was a student at Miami-Dade College Wilson campus with Gabby Pacheco and Carlos Roa and Felipe Matos, you know, when they walked the trail of dreams and seeing swear coming up out of that, and seeing that there was undocumented kids that, they could not vote, but they knew how to get the people who loved them to get them out. And that's what we did. And so understanding that we really don't have the separate movement. We have singular movements that's been separated by the powers that be, to make us think that we're fighting separate fights, and to make us think that we need different tactics and different sets of funding and all of that kind of stuff, when the reality is that our movements are all centered around how do we treat another human being with dignity and respect, right? And so that is what I am most helpful about, because we prove with Amendment 4 that people that's closest to the pain can actually bring about the change that we want to see, and that is the key to really increasing civic engagement and civic participation, but not with Becky from Iowa coming to tell me to go vote and why it's so important, right? But for my own flesh and blood, for my own neighbor to do so. And we did it. We were able to bring about the first African-American district attorney in the history of Florida. Wow. By just doing that. We were able to unseat a 13-year incumbent by just being able to do that. We were able to propel Amendment 4 across the finish line by just doing that. Keeping it simple, and all of that, believe it or not, can be traced right back to love.
Yes. I have to add, though, about the opportunity. I actually think the opportunity and the challenge is the same thing. Like, I think the opportunity, which is challenging, to learn from each other. Like, even since last night, being here and listening to the panels and to the workshops, like how we're grappling with how do we talk about mass detention and mass incarceration in a balanced way, right? Like, are we prioritizing one over the other? Like, what does that conversation look like, right? And then how do we give each other enough grace that when we do, and when it comes across as if we're prioritizing one to the other, it's not out of malice, just because we're speaking from what we know of, right? So like even watching that here in the past, just since last night, to me, it feels like something new. And something that's an opportunity that we could do more of and model for each other. Like I was in a workshop session specifically for API and talking about incarceration of API, immigrants and Americans, and figuring out the language around that. And when people talk of mass incarceration, how do we not just make it a black thing? Because it impacts other communities. Like, I don't think I've ever had that conversation anywhere in this country in the past 8 years of doing this work. So, but those are the kind of opportunities that I think we have to really take advantage for and create spaces for, so that people can say things that they think might be faulty or may be politically incorrect, but we can actually see each other and learn from each other as we're making the mistake or maybe saying the wrong thing. I think that's an opportunity.
Yes, and I also think it's important, though, for us to define goals where we get to work together, where we actually have political objectives, campaigns, and opportunities where we're in a room together, working together in support of one another. Obviously, felon disenfranchisement is an example of a campaign that could bring people together across lines of race and all of that, but it doesn't directly address the experience of those who can't vote because they lack citizenship. And so, I'll throw out there one suggestion, which is, for many years I was not terribly excited. I wasn't opposed to it at all, but I wasn't terribly excited about campaigns to abolish private prisons, because I worried that those campaigns sent the message that what was wrong was that they were private, that people were making money off of them, when it was the fact that we were caging millions of people that was wrong, and having public mass incarceration isn't better than having private mass incarceration. That, there was a danger in defining the enemy as the privatization of prisons. However, I do think that today, given that the majority of immigrant detention centers are run by private prisons, and because we now see many of these, private prison companies, the companies that are running and funding private prisons, kind of reallocating their funds towards community surveillance and monitoring, as we see kind of this political shifting towards some prison downsizing, but enormous expansion in electronic surveillance and monitoring, and private prisons making, poised to make billions of dollars off of this move. That private prisons are an example, or private prison companies are an example of an opportunity where we could bring together the movements against mass incarceration with the movements against mass detention around both a common enemy, grounded by a moral vision, having the opportunity to work together, to strategize together, to hear each other's stories, learn more about each other's experience, so long as we don't misdefine the goal as shifting from a private system to a public one, and instead use it as an opportunity to expose the ways in which capitalism and the relentless, search for opportunities to exploit poor people and people of color have repeatedly helped to birth these enormous systems of control.
So let me try to push this a little bit. What if that is, what if, like, going after private prisons, right? What if that is not the goal, but just one of the mechanisms that moves us further, right? And so if I don't kind of look at that like I told folks, remember, before, it wasn't a goal. It wasn't the end all, right? It's the beginning of a new beginning, right? I think that in order, it's not necessarily about the so-called these goals or these next steps. What I think is that there was a book that I think came out of Columbia University called Crossing Borders, right? And that book attempted to deal with the divide between the African American and Latino communities, right? And how we see each other. And we actually there is a training that was actually developed from that, where African Americans are standing like maybe 3 inches away from a Latino, and the Latino is, and the question is that they're each sharing a moment in their lives that they were discriminated, right, by someone that let the person remind them of, right? And at the end it was, I'm sorry, but it wasn't me, right? And I think there is a healing, and it's a painful healing that we've been avoiding, right? That we have to engage in first, right? Because if we don't engage in that, because I'm telling you, I remember when I was working on felon disenfranchisement, and there was nobody that would give me a penny, right? And I was seeing the tons of money that was being spent on immigration, comprehensive immigration reform. That was the end thing back then, right? And I was like trying to tell folks, listen, if we can enfranchise folks in Florida, that's going to move the needle for everybody. Just give me a penny or two. And nobody was like, and then some resentment started to build up there, right? And even to where we even within the organization I was working with, that we were having clergy, African-American clergy, working overtime on comprehensive immigration reform, while in the back of their heads wanting to know if these same white people that is running this organization going to invest that same energy and resources into dealing with the issues in my black community. And so once again, it's not that I don't like you, Jose, but it's more about my problem haven't been addressed.
Yeah.
My itch haven't been scratched yet, and I've been crying to get it scratched for so many years, and now you're asking me to put my itch on hold for your itch, not even understanding that we have the same itch.
And I think that's the challenge. I'm not going to name the person, but I was having a conversation. I went to this retreat, 10 conservatives, 10 Democrats, and I guess I'm an independent, so can't even vote. So I went to this retreat. It was really intense. It was like in a cabin. I'm not a cabin person. In Maryland, and it was really crazy. And I like numbers as a journalist, right? So I was saying that in this country today, we have 45 million immigrants. I don't know if you all knew that. 45 million immigrants, mostly Latinx and Asian, although African, Caribbean, Middle Eastern, but mostly Latinx and Asian. 11 million of whom are here in this country without documents. So 11 million of the 45 million is undocumented. According to the Pew Research Center, in the next 50 years, right, those 45 million people will constitute 88% of the total US population growth. By the way, that's one of the reasons why Trump got elected, just FYI, right? That cultural dynamic, that change, right? So I was saying this to a group full of people, and we had somebody from the log cabin Republicans, so it was like a really interesting group of people. And this woman who worked in the Obama administration, black woman, after I said these numbers, said, hey, I hear that, but you have to realize, Jose, we're the priority minority. She said, what? I was like, I think I knew what she was saying. The gaffes, the white people in the room was like, what? Because all of a sudden the conversation wasn't about white people anymore. It was like, this black woman telling me that, hey, your numbers may be growing, but we're the priority minority and nothing moves without us. She dropped that. And I looked at her and I said, you're right. And then I sat with myself for the entire retreat up in the cabin, what it meant by saying you're right. That was 3 years ago, and I'm still sitting with what that means in my head. So that gets us to the moral commitment. That gets us to, thank you for sharing that, Desmond. But so how do we get to this point where funding and the way the nonprofit is structured, that we're not being pitted against each other? That, they're not seeing that because we give you this funding doesn't mean that we're taking that away from you. What does that look like? What kind of commitment should we get from philanthropy, right? Who fuel so much of this work? And how do we get outside of philanthropy? Is philanthropy enough? That's a big question that I'm grappling with, you know? And what does it look like to know, like, thank you for saying it in that way, my itch hasn't been scratched yet, right? And listen, like, you know, this is what the new Jim Crow showed us. Just because you pass the 1965 Civil Rights Act doesn't guarantee. Just because you pass immigration reform, are you all of a sudden going to think that 45 million people in this country are going to feel welcomed and included in this country? Are laws enough when they're not just? So I think those to me are questions that we can use to figure out what further engagement look like that challenges us while actually addressing what the opportunities could be.
Well, we're going to transition to Q&A in just 1 minute here. I want to throw out one final question, leave the hard ones for last. No, I want to kind of just pause for a minute on the question of these challenges. And I think I mentioned in a conversation earlier to you that I recently had a conversation with 2 black men who are well-known names and voices kind of within the movement to end mass incarceration, who were very concerned by this idea of kind of merging movements. When I shared that I felt like we could no longer exclude mass detention and the people who are being held in immigrant detention from our conception of mass incarceration, that if we're going to talk about mass incarceration, we have to include all people who are in cages, as well as all those who are under some form of penal control, all those who have the monitors on them, whether they're wearing monitors because they were snatched by Border Patrol or snatched by police or snatched by ICE, all those who are subject to legal discrimination in this country, denied basic human rights because they have a criminal record or because they don't have a green card, that we have to stop imagining that the system of mass incarceration doesn't include people who are in certain kinds of cages for different reasons. And I was met with pretty fierce resistance, and they both expressed fear that by merging these movements, by broadening our sense of what mass incarceration is to include immigrants, that the experience of black people would wind up getting erased, that all of the media attention now is flowing to the border, that there is this narrative of innocence around people who are coming to this country in search of a better life that does not extend, that narrative in the public imagination doesn't extend to those who are going to prison for other kinds of offenses. Even if they too are struggling to survive, they are not seen in that way. And that ultimately joining forces will wind up with immigrants who can pass as white or are perceived as white being embraced and assimilated while black people remain left behind as they always have been. And I think that that is a real concern with a real history and legitimate reasons, and yet I know that we will never slay this beast if we imagine that we can fight these battles alone and isolated and without a moral vision that encompasses us all. So I'm curious, as we transition into Q&A, if each of you could respond to those kinds of concerns that I think are raised by people. They may not get stated publicly in forums where folks are afraid of backlash or being called out on Twitter, but I think that those are real concerns. And I think that the xenophobia and all of that is found in the white community but can found in the black community, and that immigrants can be very racist against black folks too. And those are real barriers and challenges that stand in the way of building a united movement that are difficult to talk about, but also very real.
And Michelle, I mean, you're right. You're right. There is that real concern, and it is so legitimate to that reality. You know, as a black person, you know, there is a level of anxiety that folks can feed off of our misery to promote their cause, and then we're still struggling, and you see it time and time again. You know, there's some claims, and I'm not the expert to speak on it, but even with the women's rights movement that they took from, you know, the black experience and pulled the women into that, and they got propelled, but black folks were still in this misery. And so that is something that is real and legitimate in our reality. But it is a legitimate concern, but when you talk about it in that aspect, I challenge folks to look at the movements of mass incarceration and mass detention as not the end all, but rather as fruits on a tree. That there's something even deeper than that where we unite, right? A good friend of mine, Dr. Vincent Ntandi, wrote this book called African Americans and the Atomic Bomb. And it explored the active, I think James Baldwin was one of the folks that was part of this community of African Americans that was protesting the United States bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I always mess up help me out. Nagasaki. And the interesting part of that book, right, was actually not the act, because the black folks was like horrified at what happened, and their thinking was, man, if they can do it, if they can obliterate, all right, just a whole a race of folks by just dropping it, what will they do to us, right? But here was a part of the book that I think is relevant to this, is that what the United States did before they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima was that they engaged in a propaganda campaign that painted the picture of Japanese in such a way that they were slant-eyed yellow devils that was going to burn and burn down villages and rape women and children. And what they did was they engaged in a process of dehumanizing the Japanese folks, so that when they dropped the bomb, it wouldn't be that much of an outrage, or when they round them up and put them in camps, it wouldn't be that much of an outrage, because they're not as human as I am, right? And we've seen that happen with with drug laws and even with Mexican Americans and how they were dehumanized, right, and blamed for all kinds of crazy stuff when these drug laws started coming in, especially around marijuana, right? And then we see it in the African American community where we are super predators and that we're welfare queens and we're crack babies. It was all the process of dehumanizing folks. And so I think that what really lies at the heart that really brings us together is that root of the tree, which is the practice of devaluing humanity or the lives of others, right? Saying that some people are more valuable than others, right? Or some people are more worthy than others, right? And that's the narrative that we come together. And when we come together on that, it fixes all that other stuff, right? But I think as long as we're trying to unite at these higher or the level of a fruit, it's going to be that friction that you got to deal with, which is going to lead us right back to the root, and that is how do we change a narrative? How do we have this shared language? How do we move forward in this spirit of love and understanding that all human beings are created in the likeness and image of a greater being and are worthy of respect, love, honor, and be treated with dignity. Every single human being, right? No matter their sexual identity, their preferences, their age, their skin, their country of origin, they deserve it, and we have to find a way to get right there and come out of there. And so I have to recognize the anxieties because it is real. It's something that has happened, that people have experienced. You know, we have that in our communities, even in South Florida. But I think that we could spend a lot of energy at that level, which is just picking the fruit off a tree, and that tree is going to bear some more bad fruit. Or we can recommit ourselves to really digging even deeper than that, right, and finding out what is that common thread that binds us together, that we can come together on and shift the narrative that will change the type of fruit that the tree bears.
I'm just really glad, Michelle, that you brought this up to the conversation, because I do think it's valid and it's real, and I hear it, not publicly, as you said, right? And I struggle with trying to, the notion of immigrants is so married to the issue of immigration reform, and we operate under the assumption that all Latinx people are progressives, when in reality, you know, there was some statistic that said like 30% or 25% of Latinx people voted for Trump. Are we going to assume that Asian and API people are all progressives? Do not make that assumption one bit, right? So when we're talking about immigration, we're actually talking about, again, this new America that is literally being built. We are looking at a demographic change unlike anything this country has ever seen, right? And to me, while that's happening, it's completely natural and organic that those questions about priorities will be erased, which has always been the history, right? When it comes to the history of black people in this country, there's Native Americans in this country. Like, that's absolutely important. But I think now we're at this, and Trump, I don't like the term silver lining because I don't want to think of a silver lining in Trump. But I just think we're being given an opportunity to engage each other at a deeper level. And, you know, Ryan Eller, our executive director, was making sure, hey, let's finish this off with something uplifting. So I've been thinking about that since Ryan texted that to me, and I was watching, because as you can tell, I love YouTube, and Cornel West was going off on James Baldwin, and Cornel West was talking about the difference between having hope and being a hope. That having hope is too spectatorial, right? It's passive. You know what being a hope is? Being a hope is me flying out of, LaGuardia on Monday, knowing that I can get arrested on the spot while I go through TSA, but knowing that even if I get arrested, I have an entire community of people that will make sure the bond letters are written and I'll get out of jail, right? Being a hope, knowing that my life and our existence as undocumented people weigh more than any piece of paper that hasn't been written or any laws that haven't been passed. Being a hope, to me, is understanding that our humanity must transcend, I don't want to call them divisions, but to me, speaker, you talked about it at the beginning, Michelle, what are the fundamental goals that we have for each other? And when I'm trying to be hopeful, I look at that. And, since we are in Harlem, Baldwin, right? I remember this thing from The Fire Next Time when he said, everything now we must assume is in our hands. We don't have any right to assume otherwise. And then he said, and if we, the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, but after Michelle Alexander's speech, the relatively conscious Asians, Latinx, middle, all of us, if we do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end this racial nightmare and change the history of the world. If we do not dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy recreated by the Bible in songs by former slaves are upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, fire next time. I would argue that all of us now are being compelled to dare much bigger things what are you risking? What are you willing to risk? I think to me that's the question of how hopeful we can all be in what we risk together.
Thank you for ending on that note. No? I'm getting all kinds of, we don't have time for questions? Oh, okay. Please raise your hands if you have questions. Yes.
Yay, Eddie.
Happy New Breath, everyone. My name is Eddie Zhang, and I'm very grateful to be in this space right here just because the spaces that I normally go to, I know many of the people in the same space talking about the same thing for the last decade. Right? Because that's the only last decade. I only say last decade because after serving 21 years incarcerated as a juvenile life-term prisoner, I have only been out for the last 12 years. And what I defy is the narrative of Asian Americans don't go to prisons. And that we are successful, that the mass incarceration and deportation machine does not affect us. So what gives me hope as we are in Harlem, and then when I look at all of you who are leading this tough conversation, what really inspired me to really want to share is that we have the moral duty, right, to be able to do exactly what Ashada Shakur has encouraged us and inspired us to do. Is that we have a duty to fight and we have a duty to win, and then we have nothing to lose but our chains. And when Malcolm X was assassinated in the Audubon Ballroom, the person who cradled him as he inhaled his last breath was a Japanese revolutionary named Yori Kochiyama. Now, how did that relationship form? And how is that politic alliance formed? That's what gives me hope. And what gives me hope is that when it's Black August inside the California prisons, the prisoners are coming together to celebrate Black August, to extend that celebration to the people who died and sacrificed their lives, so we have the rights and privileges that we have today. So it takes political education and cross-cultural healing and engagement for all of us, especially all of us who consider ourselves progressives or lefts, to be able to really think about how do we do that as a way to create that racial solidarity and equity that really we are striving for. It's because we are fighting the same common enemy, which is the structural racism that destroyed the humanity of the Native Americans and the African Americans. And that is something that I learned from inside the prison system. As an immigrant who didn't speak English, who committed a crime to hurt people in order for me to finally to become politically and socially conscious. How do I do that? So in this sense, I really want to encourage us as we're talking about this intersectionality to not just look at all the surface, the challenge that we have, but really look at the systemic issues that really brought us together as being oppressed people. Right? And when we're talking about what are we willing to risk and I'm saying what are we willing to live for? What are we willing to live for? Lastly, I just want to say that there's a role for all of us in our lives. But one thing that we have the duty to do is to be able to maximize the breath that is sustaining our lives. How do we maximize that so our lives doesn't just gone in vain? Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle Alexander, thank you for how you opened up. And what sticks with me is that thought of beast with many heads that needs to be slayed. And for me, I've been boiling since last night as well, Mr. Vargas, because the narratives need to happen with those that are deeply affected, but I say those people who were incarcerated for decades. I have friends, I grew up in Harlem, and because of the Rockefeller laws, those guys are just coming home like now. Those sentences have been reduced, but yet they still spent decades in prison. However, as a family member, I know that us on the outside of prison don't know the stories of what really takes place in prison because they're so brutal. Our family members didn't tell us details of what happened to them in prison, the stories, because we on the outside would be calling the prisons, and that would make life very difficult for them on the outside. So even when they come home, we don't know the truth about what really goes on in prison. So I say that to say that I want to hear the narratives and the stories of the people who are mostly affected by mass incarceration. However, in the conversation, you constantly hear reference to the Bible, these kumbaya moments. But the truth of the matter, no one talks about violence in the Bible, even divine violence. I'm here as a student in my old age, and I think sometimes we're not realistic that in the conversation, we sometimes might have to talk about the possibility of violence if change doesn't come about. People think differently, their thoughts shift when they say, oh, if we don't deal with this, there may be a revolution. Early on, the question was asked, what stops people from moving forward in many issues? Even though we may be suppressed or oppressed, we find a little piece of privilege in our lives, the way we move, that we say, we don't want to lose that little bit of privilege, so we're not really willing to risk anything. But it behooves me how we keep looking at the Bible. We use those pretty points to say, have faith, have hope. But is anyone really ready to say, this beast that needs to be slain, the language doesn't match? Because when you say dismantle, slay, sometimes you have to use force that equates to what people may say is violent, but we're going through brutal times. The movement is brutal. What do you do? So I would like someone on the panel to respond to that, because the whole conversation has to be changed. And I'd like to see more men and women in the room telling their story, because when you talk about the prison system, they know the nuances of how the systems work. I used to visit people in prison, and several times I've given COs $300, $400, leaving it in the bathroom garbage can so that my relative could move smoothly through the prison. So what would that look like if prisoners were given an opportunity after they served their time to be given a chance to have a job in the system? Who best knows how the prison system works than an ex-prisoner? Of course, that'll never happen, but those would be safer jails, because a person would come into jail, serve their time, but yet be treated like a human being, because now the person who used to be the prisoner is now overseeing the prisoner. So what they're going to do what they're supposed to do, and not treat a person like they're no longer human. Sorry for going so long.
There was a lot there, so let me start with, okay. So I've only been detained once. It was only for 8 hours. And since I'm privileged, you know, I got out after 8 hours. But I have to tell you, like, being detained with those, I was detained in 2014 when President Obama was telling those kids from Central America that they shouldn't be coming. And we were conflating all these issues that really, DACA is not the Central American refugee crisis. We're conflating all of these issues together. And this was back in the time when they separated the boys from the girls, so I was with the boys in the cell. And it was, ages maybe 7 to 13. And that's why after, while I was going through this, we have to stop calling them detention centers. They're jails, right? And I have to tell you something. I don't know when you said about holding on to faith. And as I said, I'm an atheist. I'm Catholic by colonization, right? But as I was sitting in that jail cell with like apples and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, really cold floor with Mylar blankets, all I could think of was whoever God was, God did not intend this. Whoever God was. He did not intend that these kids would be separated from their parents, as many of them were. Not a lot, as what's happening with the Trump administration right now, but they were. And that was not God's way. And I have to tell you, even if it's not real, that gave me some sort of comfort to know that there was something better than what was going on, even though I'm an atheist. I don't know how I justify that in my head, but it's the same justification that I say to myself when I think about the fact that I haven't seen my mom for 27 years, right? And if I leave, they won't let me back in. And if she's trying to wait to come here legally, but she's waiting in line, and by the time she gets here, the Trump administration is going to get their way, and my mom is not considered somebody with merit, so therefore she may not be able to come at all. So I have to hold on to something. And I guess that's what I try to hold on to, as illogical as that may sound.
Yeah, there was a lot there, and so I'll take the other part. As a person that I've been in military prison, I did some time in Leavenworth at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks, as well as some time in the state of Florida, and so I can attest to what you were saying about that. There are some things that go on in there that we just don't talk about, and for personal reasons and even for safety reasons, especially when you're in there, because it could cause even more harm. And that's, I think that when you talk about putting the person in the cage, I think that trauma that they experience is relative to that individual, And so I can't say because I was locked up 20 years, that gives me more of a say than someone who was locked up 19 years or whatever. It's about just that experience and that trauma. But what I can speak to, and so somebody is on stage that can share that story, and I think we've heard some people at the beginning of, I think yesterday, the opening plenary that really spoke to that, and there's a growing number of people who've been incarcerated that have emerged as leaders in this movement, and right next to them are family members, because we understand that when we do time, our loved ones do time right along with us, and there's another a set of traumas that go along with that for people on the outside, and so that space is growing every day, and I don't think, and I push back on one thing when you said that would never happen about a prisoner actually running the prison. I believe that we don't want prisons. Eventually, we don't want prisons, but I think at some point, and we're seeing it even in the state of Washington, where a formerly convicted person is now a part of the running the reentry administration in Washington State, and we see the FBI. They use computer hackers, right? They actually employ computer hackers to defend against hacking, and so it does make sense that we employ people who have been impacted to actually be a part of that system and help change that system and facilitate it. But with the goal of actually eventually eliminating all of that, which I think we will get to. But the other piece is I used to talk about, I used to have this training where I called it Give Faith a Job, right? And it was always to faith-based folks. So we talked about faith without works is dead, right? And understand that we can have all of the faith in the world. If we're not picking up that shovel and if we're not doing that work, then the change that we so-called are hoping for or waiting for might not happen. But when you talk about the desire to bring about a change and like my brother was saying, people, we need to live, be willing to live for this. You know, what I share is that not everyone is going to have the passion that you have, because not everyone is going to have the same experiences that you have, right? And I had to learn to live with that. But then I also had to learn to understand the difference between commitment and contribution. That there are going to be some people that's just going to be making a contribution to this, and I have to be willing to live with that, right? But I have to be able to differentiate between those two. And what I found back in the days was that I wasn't able to, and people who were doing the contributing or whatever weren't able to differentiate, and they thought they were making a commitment to some things. And so eventually I stumbled on a solution to that, and the solution was the ham and cheese omelet. You know, because we know that the ingredients in the ham and cheese omelet is eggs, ham, and cheese. And of course, if you was poor like me growing up, we got to add egg to it because the egg kind of like stretched the milk out the eggs out a little bit, the milk. And so we knew that the chicken came from the egg, the egg came from the chicken. We knew that the milk and the cheese came from the cow, and we knew that the pig produced the pork, right? And so in order to really get a clear understanding of these two, I had to understand that, number one, that the chicken made a contribution to the ham and cheese omelet. The cow made a contribution to the ham and cheese omelet. The pig, he made a commitment to the ham and cheese omelet. And that really helped me understand this. That, you know, when you talk about, well, are you committed to this? Are you committed to this change, or you just want to make a contribution to this change? Because if you just want to make a contribution, then when it gets a little dicey, you're gonna step back a little bit. You know, but when you're committed, that means that you are willing to make that ultimate sacrifice for that thing. What is it that you are willing to die for, right? And so understanding that when you find that not everybody else around you is going to be at that same space, and you can't, if you're expecting them to be at that space, then there's going to be that constant level of frustration with that individual, and not understanding that sometimes people are there just for a season. They're there to contribute, not to commit. Not to commit. Sometimes we have to carry that cross. I know I carried that cross, right? But here's the deal. The commitment wasn't to felon disenfranchisement. The commitment wasn't to ending mass incarceration. The commitment wasn't to winning Amendment 4. The commitment was to creating a world in which all lives were valued and treated with dignity. That's what I'm willing to die for, right? Not a political gain, you know, that might shift, that will shift the political landscape for decades to come. No, that's fleeting. What's more everlasting and more eternal is that current that binds us all together, and that states that yes, that little boy, that snotty-nosed boy, down, when we walk out of here and we see that homeless person sitting down, then know that that person is just as valuable as I am and deserves to be treated just like I would want to be treated, right? That's what I'm willing to die for. How do we get to that space? How do we let that guide everything else that we do, right? But knowing everybody's not there yet. Everybody's not willing to die for that yet. Maybe they're willing to die for some of those fruits, but there's some that will die for that, and you just got to bear, you got to carry that cross.
Hey, this is a question, I guess, to all three of you, but particularly Jose. We talk about, Michelle, what does justice require, that being a moral question. What role does journalism play in this? And is it, I mean, does it fit into that framework, that moral framework, and should we re-examine it in this day and age when we talk about mass incarceration, when we talk about the border? And I guess, Desmond, are there enough pigs in journalism? You know, I say this as a journalist who now finds myself as a first-year student here at Union. So these questions are kind of going through my mind, and you guys raise a lot of them.
Okay, I'm gonna try to answer this question. I grew up in newsrooms. It was like my church. And to think, and let me just say that there's some great work happening. I have to tell you, I don't know if you've seen the New York Times' package on 1619, the 1619 Project. I mean, just astounding. I got a printed copy of it, and I started thinking, I don't think that would have been possible in a newsroom in the New York Times or the Washington Post just 5 years ago, right? I don't think that would have happened. And so that's really, that's wonderful, right? And that should be celebrated. But then I look at how an issue as central to American politics right now, like immigration, is being handled. Like, we're still right now in a fight with the New York Times, our paper of record, to stop calling people illegal. This is the New York Times. And you know who's doing it even worse? The Washington Post. So the people, the organizations which dictate so much of what, quote unquote, the mainstream news media reports and how they frame stories is still built on the fact that these are really not people. Are we surprised then that we don't have policies that treat people with the dignity to treat them as human beings? So later this week, Define American is actually launching a very important study at the Online News Association, which is the largest gathering of journalists every year. It's in New Orleans this year. If you're not following us, please follow us on Facebook and it's all of that at Define American. And we're going to launch this study and specifically about reportage on immigration in this era. And really calling out news organizations, not only the national ones, but local and regional ones, right? Like, if you're in Ohio, if you're in Wisconsin, if you're in Texas, right? If you're in these states that are quote unquote battleground states, how are you contextualizing not only the facts, but how are you synthesizing, right? And the moral responsibility of journalists to ask really hard questions. FYI, it's not called Define Immigrant, it's called Define American with a question mark. It's a really provocative, dangerous question. I would argue too that when it comes to most journalists, and I used to be a political reporter back in 2007, and I'm getting so worried about this campaign because I can already see how this is the conversation. If you have not read the transcript of the conversation that Dean Baquet at the New York Times had with his newsroom about whether or not to call racism, I highly recommend that you look for the transcript. It's fascinating. It's a hard thing to be doing, but I think every newsroom is grappling with how to rise up to the historic moment and the crisis that we're living in. And I would argue in newsrooms, if I were working in a newsroom right now, if I wasn't feeling uncomfortable, if I wasn't making someone mad, if I wasn't adding another paragraph to contextualize something that has to do with race and class and identity, then I'm probably not doing my job. Right?
Pork. I don't even know how to answer that question other than, I have a problem with the media. Just in my personal experiences, I think that they're more interested in the clicks, right, than anything. And I have experience where media journalists have intentionally left out certain facts, conveniently, because it didn't fit with preconceived narrative that they had in their heads. And to me, that's bothersome, bordering on dangerous, right? But I do think that there are a couple of pigs there, right? They just have to deal with their editors, at the end of the day. I had one experience where a journalist came and spent some time with me and a few returning citizens a few years back, did a great job with the piece, the whole 9 yards, and his editor made him change the title of the story to something that was very divisive and caused a lot of harm to some of the returning citizens that he interviewed, and they felt betrayed, and they didn't want to deal with media for years, and it wasn't that journalist's fault, but that editor there. And so, yeah, I think there's some journalists that are some poor pigs in a good way, but at the end of the day, they have to contend with their editors and whoever owns that the paper. So.
I would just add, too, that, as Jose just mentioned, that there are shifts within the media happening today that wouldn't have been possible just 5 years ago, and that the political realities that we create outside newsrooms affect what happens inside them. And if it hadn't been for the fact that the people of Ferguson, Missouri, stood up when Michael Brown was shot down and kept standing even when the tanks rolled in, inspiring people around the country and around the globe to stand up and disrupt business as usual, so many of the racial justice conversations that are happening in all kinds of rooms, not just newsrooms, would never have happened. And yet I still hear often kind of these narratives that, protest doesn't make that big of a difference, or we can't just go back and repeat the civil rights movement, marches aren't everything, that kind of narrative. And yet what we have seen over and over again, not just in the United States, but around the world, that it's only when people who have been oppressed refuse to continue to cooperate with business as usual, and those who have privilege are willing to sacrifice some of that privilege and stand in solidarity and in unity, that disruptions occur that create openings for these narratives to be changed, for conversations to change as all. And so I just wanted to kind of pay tribute to the fact that even the conversation we're having today, right here, might not have been possible if thousands of people had not taken to the streets and stayed in the streets and risked their lives to disrupt the kinds of conversations and narratives that had been dominating, our political realities in the media for a very, very long time. And so I know I personally feel an enormous debt of gratitude to those activists, and I hope that we remember as we move forward that that form of activism and rebellion is an essential ingredient to all of our movements in whatever form they take. So we're running out of time now, and I want to give each one of you a chance to kind of say a closing word, hopefully ending on a positive note around, and I'll say, let me pose the question this way. As people are walking out of here tonight, what do you want them to do? What do you want for us collectively now to do? To move our movements forward, to collectively to advance our efforts to act not just in solidarity, but to build kind of a deeper understanding of what unites us, what's at stake, and ultimately what we're fighting for.
I'm just really hoping that after this conference that we can never look at these issues as not connected. That we have started the conversation, as messy as it may seem for right now, as, you know, that we cannot look at these issues as separate from one another. That in many ways, you know, Michelle, you called it revolutionary, and I think it has the seeds for that. But it's going to require not only words, but actions, and actually figuring out, you know, Michelle and I were just talking, what do we do after this? Like, what's the next step? So we will be talking about that. Because we are definitely going to figure out what the next steps are, right? But hopefully everybody who's attended these conferences, this conference and the workshops and sat into the panels, that you can see now some light has actually has been shed on how these two issues are interconnected. That's my hope.
Wow. So I'm sitting here thinking that, Michelle, you asked me to give them something to leave on a positive note, but then you asked me to tell them to work, right? I'm trying to give them some work. Well, you know, Amendment 4. Here we had, like I said before, it was issue of felon disenfranchisement. It dealt with voting, and it was in the state of Florida, right? In a political climate that we were in, all right, where there was just so much just like hate and all division and fear, right? And that, but in spite of all of that, we were able to not only get on the ballot, but actually win with a supermajority of the votes, right? And we did it without any opposition. And as a matter of fact, the people who we thought were going to be opposition actually endorsed the campaign. So we got endorsed even by part of the Coke Industries, Christian Coalition. There were Republican groups in Florida that endorsed the campaign. There were legislators that actually endorsed and spoke about the campaign, right? And that's kind of like, and in that climate, we were still able to emerge, you know? And we ran a faith-based initiative. Within Reverend Rowe was part of that, where we brought together over 827 congregations of faith. What we had in there, we had African-American churches, we had Latino evangelicals, we had white evangelicals, we had the Jewish community, we had the Islamic community, all coming together under one umbrella, saying the same thing, marching to the same beat. And the question is, in this era, where there was all this division and all of this hate, how were we able to accomplish that? And I'm taking how we were able to accomplish it as a charge to each and every one of you, right? When you leave out of here, understanding that there is something that is powerful in that word love, right? It's something that's very powerful because that love actually demands that you become the pig. Not for your own personal gain or for your own personal positions, but for someone else, for your neighbor. That word love challenges you to expand on who your neighbor is. and how you interact. And I believe that what Amendment 4 showed, right, is a pathway moving forward on how we can engage in people in such a way and embrace the diversities that in our communities, and to be a champion, right, for some shared values. Be a champion for these shared values, especially when it ties around treating every human being with dignity, respect, and with love. That's your challenge.
Thank you so much to both of you for this really important conversation. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who's made this conference possible. Good night.